Hey guys, so I'm here to go over my recent performance in the 2019 Pro Chess League. I've been playing for the San Jose Hackers ever since the team started and the Pro Chess League started a few years ago. Overall, my record in the Pro Chess League has been pretty wretched. In general, I'm not the best online player as it is, and I'm also not the best blitz and rapid player either. So those two things combined into one has always been somewhat tough for me. But that said, I do enjoy playing, and I never want to turn down an opportunity to play for a team such as the Hackers that, of course, have so many good players and a bit of a legacy now in the Pro Chess League since we've been there from the start. So the day I played was one of the Battle Royale days where our team basically plays one match of 4 games against 7 other teams. And it's not the teams in our division, but actually this time it was a mix of teams from basically all over the world, which was pretty cool. And basically that means that I was supposed to play a round robin against all of the other players on board 3 for their teams. And turns out to be a total of 7 games. So on our team was Shak Mamedyarov, our top dog, who is of course an incredibly strong player. Board 2 this time playing, I believe it was Eltar Safarli, who's also a really strong GM from Azerbaijan. Like I mentioned, I was on board 3, and on board 4 we had Vinesh Raveri, who's really strong, very underrated player. He's really scored a lot of points for the Hackers, and we have a lot to thank him for. Vinesh was also one of my teammates in the recent US Amateur Team West, so that was kind of cool to play alongside him. But this was all online, so of course I was on my own here. And yeah, for this video I basically wanted to go over some of the critical points from that day. Overall I performed pretty badly, 1.5 out of 7, and I definitely feel like I had some chances in games, especially in round 1. I think I was an underdog in most of the games. I think I was one of the lower rated players in the group, but we were all close enough that it didn't really feel like I was much of an underdog in many of the games. I think everyone was rated somewhere in the 24 to 2500 range. So in round 1 I was playing against International Master Vincent Keymer, who actually might be a Grandmaster soon. He's a really talented junior from Germany. And we had kind of a messy game. Somehow we found ourselves in this position, and he, playing black, played this move knight e5, which I think was quite a nice move, opening up the bishop on this diagonal and really setting up a future attack against my king on g1. The immediate threat I figured was queen c6, so I played knight takes d4, grabbing the pawn and stopping this threat. And here he goes rook a3, another good move, just putting pressure on all sides of the board. Now concretely I had one move here to at least keep the game equal, which I did not find or not even consider. I think a few players would, but it really is an amazing move, so I wanted to highlight it. White's main problem is, of course, if I play like knight takes b5, which looks great because I'm forking his pieces, he has queen to c6, and because of the mate threat, I'm basically just losing the knight and losing the game. But because this idea kind of exists in the position, White has this fantastic resource, bishop d5, as Stockfish finds in literally, less than a half second when you plug it in. So this move is incredible. It's basically stopping the diagonal play from Black's point of view. If e takes d5 or bishop takes d5, then White can take on b5, and I'm going to be picking up the rook on a3. So concretely, after queen e7, these complications end in some kind of draw. I doubt, even with more time on my clock, I would have ever found bishop d5 or the resulting moves after. Instead, I played the move f4, which looked extremely risky because it felt like I was opening up my king even further, but I also felt like it was double-edged because I'm, of course, attacking the knight, and if the knight is moving out of the way, I'm setting up all kinds of sacrifices on e6, so I was looking for this counterplay. And basically it worked out. Black had a couple ways to get a winning advantage. Specifically, I think the easiest was knight to g4, just opening up an attack against this knight on d4 and getting his knight closer to my king. And yeah, I think it's very difficult for White. If I take on e6, most likely Black can just ignore this knight and play queen c6 and go for the checkmate, and I'm really I'm really getting punished on this diagonal. Instead, black played queen d8, so understandably we're both in time trouble at this point. The time control I don't think I mentioned was game in 10 plus 2-second increment. So basically it's not quite an immediate blitz game, but it turns into one very, very quickly. And I think we were both under 3 minutes at this point. He might have even been running even lower than that. So there was, as you can imagine, a ton of mistakes in this part of the game. Some more embarrassing than others. So after queen d8, I figured, okay, I have to take on e6 now. It just looked too tempting to pass up. The right way was to take with the d knight and keep this knight on g5. After f takes e6, bishop takes e6. I'm basically winning back the knight on e5, which I did not really realize here. King h8 allows queen takes e5, and I think I actually saw this trick during the game. The point being, after bishop takes, knight f7 check, I'm going to pick up the queen on d8. But after king f8, I don't think I quite realized that I could just play f takes e5 here. I was certainly maybe worried about something like queen d4 check. I don't exactly remember, but minimum I have queen f2, and I can trade queens and go into an endgame with a few extra pawns. So I think white is definitely doing well there. Okay, instead I took with the g knight, and I think one of my biggest mistakes of the day was that I wasn't sensing when it was the right time to calculate, and I played a lot of moves based on instinct and not on concrete calculation, which I think is overall a decent strategy when you're playing speed chess and you kind of rapid or blitz. You do have to rely on your instincts and your intuition quite a bit. But if you're overdoing it, like I kind of feel like I was after looking back on the day, then you're going to miss a lot of concrete resources. And, well, as happens to me, you end up making just a ton of mistakes. So knight takes e6, he plays fe6, I take with the knight, and now I have a ton of threats in the position. The queen is hanging, I have a potential discovered attack, his knight is still hanging. He went knight f3 check, king f2. And here he made basically a losing mistake with rook takes b3, going for a queen sacrifice that doesn't quite work out. I think he should have played the move queen f6. Of course, this is all engine analysis. And had he found this move, I mean, it would have been a total mess. White has to play something like c6. I have no idea why, in order to survive. And yeah, I mean, basically all three results would have been possible, but I think the engine does like black with objectively the best play. Instead, he plays rook takes b3, which does look scary at first, but it doesn't actually amount to a win. I took the queen on d8, bishop d4 check, and here was, yeah, easily my biggest mistake of the game. I really wasn't expecting him to sacrifice the queen, so rook takes b3 certainly caught me by surprise here. I figured, okay, I have no real option but to take bishop d4 check, and yeah, here I intuitively felt like white should not be losing, but of course I started calculating concretely and tried to figure out where to put my king, and my two choices seemed to be king f1 and king g2. And yeah, to be perfectly honest, I simply hallucinated here. I thought that if I play the move king f1, he would have knight takes h2 checkmate, which looks like some mate, except of course the queen can just take the knight and black actually has nothing. So I kind of very quickly dismissed king f1 here because I thought knight h2 was mate. I think it's like a result of doing too much puzzle rush, because I see all these like mating patterns and I immediately assume that they're working. But basically after king f1, black just doesn't even have a way to really seriously continue the game. The problem is the bishop on b7 is hanging, and I'm threatening queen e6 check to pick up the rook, or maybe just to give mate with the queen and knight. And so if black doesn't win back the queen or give checkmate, basically black is just going to be losing way too much material here. And so this would have been the end of the game. Had I played this move, it would have been over. Instead, during the game, as I was hallucinating that there was a potential mate with knight h2, instead I figured I have no choice but to play king to g2. And this simply loses because now he can play knight takes e1 with a double check, so I can't take his bishop, I can't take his knight, I have to play king h3. Now black has a lot of material for the queen and is actually winning the queen back by force with bishop g2 check, king g4 and bishop f3, or if I played king h4, this simply wouldn't change anything after bishop f6, forcing my king here, and black wins the queen back for not enough material, and ends up with an extra rook in the position. So basically this was just immediately over, and we played a few more moves, and I had to resign. Actually, bishop takes c5 was a nice trick just to make things super simple for him, because if I take, he can take here, and he picks up the knight. My pawn is running, but of course his rook is able to stop it, and his pawn is going to win the game. So yeah, I mean, this was really kind of a sad blunder, just to dismiss king f1 and you know, miss kind of an easy win. But the truth is, my biggest mistake here was actually just not spending enough time in the position. Thinking back about the game, at this point my opponent was way down, maybe had about 10 seconds left, so clearly on his last seconds, and I had a full 2 minutes still in the position, which is not a lot of time under normal circumstances, but it is a lot of time when your opponent is only left with 10 seconds. So I absolutely should have just spent more time just trying to figure out if I had any other options, because during the game I thought king f1 was mate. I thought king g2 looked very dangerous, though I wasn't quite sure if I'm losing there or not. Just looked like my only real option. But if I just spent even 5-10 seconds extra really double checking my analysis, I think I probably would have noticed that the queen is hitting on h2. So I don't really chalk this up to being some kind of tactical blunder, although it definitely was one. I think this was more of kind of a wrong attitude during the game, wanting to play quickly and not wanting to hunker down and take time when, you know, I absolutely should have sensed that this was a very, very critical moment. And yeah, I should have spent my time and figured it out. And had I did, well, okay, I would have had a much better chance of finding king f1 and would have gotten the day off on a much better start. Well, unfortunately, that one was a loss, but with 6 more rounds, I had to quickly just try to forget about it and move on to the next game. In round 2, I was playing black against Joshua Sheng, who's I believe an international master from Southern California, playing for the San Diego Surfers. I don't remember all the teams that everyone played for, so I'm only going to mention the ones that I know for sure. And yeah, I decided on this day that I was just going to play this knight c6 against everyone. In my opinion, it seems to be a really good blitz weapon. This is a pet line that I've been experimenting with in my last few tournaments. And yeah, I feel like black gets some positions that are quite intuitive and easy to play, and certainly not easy for white with limited time to figure out how to crack this opening over the board. So yeah, I made a conscious decision to play this in all 3 of my black games, and overall I think I did okay, but this was definitely a tough game. I certainly misplayed the opening. So he goes for one of the classic ways to meet this line. He just makes this early d5 push. I drop back with the knight, which is kind of the point of this line for black, with the eventual plan of bringing the knight into d7 and then trying to use either the e5 or c5 squares. But he just develops normally, advances with c4, knight c3, castles, castles, and here I played the move knight d7, which looked very natural during the game, and objectively I don't think it's such a bad move. But actually, I completely forgot that I had seen this position before in a very high level game. This was the game Kazim Zanov versus Magnus Carlsen in the Isle of Man tournament a few years ago. And I actually witnessed that game in person, and I thought it was pretty incredible that Magnus could play knight c6 on move 1 in a very important open event, you know, pretty late round against quite a strong player nonetheless. And that was before knight c6 was really gaining popularity, so he was one of the, I think, one of the pioneers of this line at the very, very top level. So in that game he played bishop g4 and opted to, well, eventually trade this bishop for the knight on f3, which I think is a pretty typical strategy, and it's the one I should have used in the game. I mean, if it's good enough for Magnus, it's probably good enough for me as well. That game went bishop e2, and then black played knight fd7 and showed a pretty nice way of gaining counterplay in this position. He soon played c6, a5, a4, put one knight on c5, brought the second knight to d7, and had a lot of pressure against white's position in the center and the queen side. So that was kind of the right way to play the position. Instead, I went with a more natural move, knight d7, and I end up getting somewhat of a passive King's Indian. White develops quite normally, bishop e3, rook c1, I put my knight on c5, and I decided to play e5. And once I get this move in, white decides not to take on passant, and just plays the move b3. We basically have a King's Indian structure, which feels a bit favorable for white because I feel like he's kind of ahead in terms of setting up the play. He has a very natural plan of playing a3 and b4. His bishop on e3, rook on c1 are already well placed. And the bishop on e1 looks a little bit silly, but it's actually going to be very useful restricting black's main idea, which is to play for f5. So I end up going knight h5. I didn't really see a better plan other than this. He goes a3. And then I followed up with f5, which looks extremely logical, but concretely is just a very, very serious mistake. The problem is that after e takes f5, g takes f5, when white inevitably takes on e5, my knight on h5 is simply going to end up hanging, and I'm losing material. So Joshua decides to play b4 first, which I think is totally correct, forcing me to move my knight away from c5. I go back to a6. And then he decides to take on e5 and go for it here. And that basically ends up to be totally crushing for white. So what black should have done other than f5, apparently I could have played this move a4, which is definitely a common idea. The point being, after b4, I try to jump in with knight to b3, and then after rook c2, I can play f5 with the intention of taking with the bishop on f5, and just taking advantage of this awkwardness of like the rook on c2, bishop on b1. And the engine gives something like rook a2, takes, knight takes b1. I think it still gives white some advantage, but it's a completely different position compared to the game, and far more playable than what I ended up getting. Because I basically just got a lost position right from the get-go. Here, yeah, I mean, looks quite reasonable for black. The knight can jump into f4, the queen comes to f6. Even though the engine gives white some small advantage here, I think in a practical game, and anything can still happen. So yeah, even though I had this kind of concrete way to get a decent position, I think still this kind of feels like not a great version of a King's Indian for black, and I feel like just my opening setup was not quite correct in the first place. Okay, after f5 and b4 is pushed, I go back, he takes on e5. It takes on h5. I do get the pawn back with knight takes b4, so I don't actually end up a pawn down. But the problem is that my position is left with a ton of weaknesses. These hanging pawns, e5 and f5, are sometimes strong in these kinds of positions, but in this position I think they're very, very vulnerable. They're easy targets, and they can't exactly push forward without creating a lot more weaknesses in the position. So black has to tend to these, and white is also just getting ready to break through with rook a d1, c5, and d6, as very quickly happens in the game. He played rook f d1, I try to get going, but c5, and yeah, the queen side is just getting torn apart. My pieces are kind of scattered all over the place, and I end up blundering a piece somewhere around here, f3, queen c4 check, and he just takes the knight on b4. So this blunder is definitely not the cause of the game, of the cause of the loss. Of course, it's more that just my position is already crumbling at this stage, and it was basically over. And I think white played a perfectly good game to convert it. So yeah, tough start, 0-2. And I mean, I definitely knew it was possible, so I just tried to keep somewhat of an optimistic mood and keep playing my game, but to also try and keep it somewhat solid and not to get shut out for the whole day. So in the next round, I was playing against International Master Deimante Cornette, who's around, I think, 2460 FIDE, and we got a pretty reasonable opening. I was playing white here in a Queen's Indian. And yeah, this was one of the cases where I again kind of took it a little bit too casually. I played the move rook ac1, which looks like an extremely natural move, but concretely runs into a few issues after knight to e4, which I totally underestimated. So once knight e4 hit me on the board, I kind of realized I'm playing to equalize now. Because if I take on e4, d takes e4, I simply don't have a good good spot to move my knight, as knight takes d4 is coming next, and then black is also going to be hitting the e2 pawn. So this e2 pawn ends up hanging in a lot of these lines. I ended up going for queen to d1. A key line that shows why white is already under a lot of pressure is, for example, if I play queen e3 here, black can take on c3. In order to keep e2 protected, I have to take with the rook, and then after rook e8, black is just going to be winning the e2 pawn anyway, and white's position is like already collapsing. So yeah, here I realized I'm in trouble, and I tried to like hunker down and make sure I can find some way to equalize. Instead of rook ac1, what white should have done is take on c5 and leave black with these hanging pawns and play against these pawns. I think the best move here is knight h4, trying to play knight f5 next move and bringing the rooks to the center and putting some pressure. And yeah, it's definitely a very playable position, and I think white has a lot to be optimistic about here. So yeah, rook c1, knight e4, I played queen d1. To me, this looked accurate. Black throws in rook e8, putting a little bit more pressure on e2, rook e1, knight takes c3, rook takes c3, and knight takes d4. And this was definitely a mistake, because it allows white to kind of simplify into really an advantageous position. I was expecting black to play something like queen f6, just piling on the pressure. And then I think after e3, white is kind of okay and should be holding here, but black is definitely not worse either. Knight takes d4 leads to a lot of exchanges on d4, queen takes d4. Bishop takes e2, black wins the e2 pawn, but now I have a choice of how to take back the pawn on d5. And during the game, I actually felt after both queen takes d5 and bishop takes d5, I would have a slight advantage, but nothing serious. But actually, I was wrong in that assessment. After queen takes d5, concretely, this actually leads to a very dangerous endgame. Because after queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, rook a d8, in the game, I basically stopped my calculations here. It just looked like, how could black have any issues? I mean, equal material, no super serious weaknesses, all the pieces are in the game. But white has this fantastic move, rook to c7, which is a really nice resource. So I'm hitting everything on the 7th rank, like hitting a7 and f7. Black is kind of forced to take on d5. Then white shows the idea, rook takes e2. The rook can't be taken back because of the back rank mate. But white is still threatening to take the a7 pawn and potentially to get the second rook on the 7th rank, which we know is going to be extremely dangerous. And so here black is losing at least one pawn. If they go rook a8, then this doesn't really change anything. I can play rook e7, or the immediate rook takes a7, because the back rank is still pretty weak. So yeah, I totally missed this resource with rook c7, but if I didn't see this move, then it's easy to see why one would think that white doesn't really have much in this endgame, but that was a very concrete resource. Instead, I decided to play bishop takes d5. I figured keeping queens on the board might provide white with slightly more chances to put pressure, but I really wasn't able to get anything going. Fortunately, I never fell worse in the game, so I was always able to keep things under control and play for 2 results. But I never had anything, any chances to really play for any kind of advantage, and eventually the game was drawn from here. But I was happy to at least get a half point and not get shut out after the first 2 losses. And yeah, now that I could avoid getting 0 out of 7, I relaxed a little bit and tried to stay optimistic about the remaining games. Okay, so in round 4. I actually ended up getting my only win of the day against International Master Thomas Beerdsen, and I'm not too familiar with him. At least I wasn't before this game, but apparently he has been scoring really well in the PCL, so I was certainly not a favorite to win this game. He's also known to be quite a sharp player, so this game ends up being well, really exciting. Okay, I played my knight c6 system again. He chose a more aggressive setup with bishop g5, queen d2, and castling queenside. And here he goes for this advance e4, e5, which is definitely a thematic idea for white against like perk type openings, but here I think it ends up being quite dubious. So black could have taken on e5. This is what the engine was suggesting, but I instead went for this move b4. which is a pretty typical counter shot in this kind of position and in the Sicilian defense as well, where, okay, once white attacks the knight on f6, we hit the knight on c3, and if this knight moves out of the way, then our knight can jump into e4 and cause some trouble. So after e takes f6, black actually has a choice here. We could either take on c3 like I did in the game, or play e takes f6. I think this was also possible, gaining a tempo on the bishop and then planning to recapture on c3 next. After some thought, I decided to take on c3, queen takes c3, and e takes f6. And the point here is that if white takes on c6, I have bishop d7, which is very important, defending the rook, hitting the queen, and I'm ready to take on g5 next move. White could play bishop takes f6, and jump back with the queen, and white is a pawn up, but after something like c5, I think black is just going to get tremendous counterplay on the queen side, and yeah, I mean, I think I would take black here all day with such nice pressure against white's king. So he correctly doesn't take on c6, he drops back with bishop e3, I went knight e7, bishop c4, and f5. This looked logical to me during the game, but this probably wasn't the right way to play the position. I should have gone for bishop f5 with idea bishop e4, and then kind of controlling all of the light squares in the center, followed with maybe rook b8 at some point, and just playing on the queen side. But I played f5, he gets his play going with h4, I think this was quite logical. I played bishop e6, and yeah, here, had he taken on e6 and pushed h5, then I think white is probably doing quite well here, because he's going to open up the h-file soon, he has bishop h6 ideas coming up, and my e6 pawn is probably going to be a target with knight g5 and maybe something to the e-file soon. So I think white is better there. Instead he played the immediate h5, but this allows me to play knight d5, which makes things a little bit awkward for white, because now I'm taking one of his bishops, either the bishop on e3, or I'm forcing him to take on d5. I think he makes the right call. He decides to give up the light squared bishop, which I think he kind of had to do. But here I felt really comfortable for black with such a strong bishop on d5 and nice pressure, again, against the queen side. So he goes bishop g5, queen d7, rook h3. He has a plan of doubling on the h-file. I think he really should have played bishop h6 first, because trading off these dark squared bishops, this feels very important for white's attacking chances in the position, just leaving black with a lot of dark square weaknesses. But he decides to double, which ends up being a pretty serious mistake. Now I needed to move my f-rook somewhere here, so against bishop h6 I could afford to move my bishop away. Instead I played c5, which gives white another chance to play bishop h6, and here he really needed to do this, and I think actually I would think that maybe white has slightly better chances, because now he has threats of taking and maybe even opening up the queen with taking on c5. But he follows his plan that he set out with rook h1, and this ends up being a really huge mistake, because now I'm able to play h5, totally shutting down his rooks and totally preventing the idea of bishop h6, and this is no longer possible. So h5 is a nice defensive move, but yeah, really causes a lot of issues for white, because he's not able to break with g4, and he's not really able to open up the h-file. So he goes queen d2, he realizes, okay, he really needs to play for bishop h6, but now my counterplay starts, and it comes quite quickly. So queen a4, I'm trying to take the a pawn, he goes a3, and rook a b8. I think I played this move kind of just intuitively, just looked like the most natural attacking move, but I had already kind of figured that all my pieces are in such nice position that I should be having some winning rook sacrifice with rook takes b2 very soon. It just looked too tempting not to pass up. And I think I had already calculated that I could do it against bishop h6, which I was kind of expecting at this point, but I definitely took some time to double check my calculations here. But yeah, I ended up playing rook takes b2, and maybe this would have been a good time to pause the video and try to figure out the lines after that as a kind of a calculation exercise. But yeah, it turns out that black is able to get there first just by a hair. After rook takes b2, of course, if white plays king takes b2, then this is just an immediate loss with rook b8 check. And black is just coming in with queen a3, rook b1, and bishop c4. and the only way to get out of check is to give up the queen. So white's critical response after rook takes b2 is to just ignore it and play bishop takes g7. And yeah, now it's like all a matter of who's going to be able to checkmate first. It's such a wild position. But if I'm not careful, then okay, white can play queen h6 and queen h8 is coming. Or if I play king takes g7, then he would most likely sacrifice on h5, which looks incredibly dangerous. But I have queen takes a3 here. It's actually not the only one in the position. Rook b1 check was, I think, a lot faster and a lot smoother, which is a really nice resource, forcing king takes b1, queen takes a3, and now black has simply too many mating threats and white has no defense. The main threat is rook b8 check, but also queen a2 followed by queen a1 is a main threat as well, so this is basically over. Not to mention bishop a2 check is also a common way to end the game here. That said, okay, my way was also good enough after queen takes a3. He played queen h6, which is kind of the only move, going for the attack and giving his king some escape squares, but now is able to calculate to the finish with rook b1 check. Okay, so king takes b1, this runs into immediate mate with rook b8, but actually the funny thing here is that I did not have this rook b8 checkmate on my radar at all. I was planning on playing bishop a2 here, leading to a pretty typical mating idea with queen takes c2 at the end. So it's forced mate anyway, it's just several moves slower than rook b8. Then the funny thing is that in the official commentary for chess.com, GM Robert Hess, they were looking at this position, and he also saw the idea after rook b1 check, king takes b1. He kind of assumed the point was to play bishop a2, bishop b3, and like go for this typical mate. And then I think someone in the chat like pointed out that rook b8 is actually mate in 1, and he also just like totally overlooked it in the position, which is kind of funny because we're always just looking for these like common mating patterns, and sometimes we'll just miss an obvious check in the position that turns out to be much stronger. So after rook b1 check, white is forced to play king d2, trying to go for a king escape, but the king just simply doesn't get out. Queen b4 check, king e3, and really important move. Without this move, white would actually be winning because the king would be able to escape on the dark squares, but black has f4 check, which just seals off the king's path and keeps the king in the mating net. So if queen takes f4, of course we can take the queen, but queen c3 check is just leading to immediate checkmate with bishop c4. Instead, after f4, white played king d3, but this is just still leading to mate. The king is just not getting out alive. King e4, queen b7, d5, and queen takes d5 was mate on the board. So yeah, this was definitely a nice win. I was happy to get this one. It also was such a sharp and exciting game, and that's always satisfying too. But unfortunately, this would be my last point of the day, and things did not get better from here. So this was round 4. Going into round 5, I was playing against, I think, FIDE Master Tianqi Wang, who I believe plays for the Miami team. And in this position, I feel like I had a pretty good setup with white. This came from a Bogo Indian, and yeah, I got the 2 bishops, I got a lot of space, but unfortunately I just wasn't able to figure out how to play the position properly and try to capitalize on my advantage. I mean, I kind of figured it out towards the end, but I failed to execute properly. Basically, I started meandering here a little bit, king h2, knight e8, and finally I really just couldn't help myself, and I played knight to d5. Which I really shouldn't have. I should have just sat on this move. The point is that white has a lot of pressure on the d file, and I have all this pressure against d6. And when I play knight d5 and then recapture with the pawn, well, I'm essentially giving up all the pressure on the d file, and my b5 pawn ends up being a pretty serious weakness. So this was a bit of impatience from me. I basically should have done anything else. One idea is to play g3, bishop g2, and kind of improve the position this way, and eventually set up an f4 break. This ends up happening in the game, though, much later. So knight d5, black starts to go after this b5 pawn, and I set up all my pieces to protect it. I finally play g3, and rook b2, bishop g2, rook b8. And I would say this was probably the critical moment. Actually, my instinct here was right, and it was to play f4, just immediately trying to rip black open on the dark squares, but I ended up convincing myself not to play the move. I decided that f3 was a bit safer. I was not sensing the danger here, and I felt like I had a lot more time than I do, and I figured I should just play this move first, restrict both of black's pieces here, and then find a way to improve my position later. But this was just wrong thinking. I really should have just tried to break through with f4 immediately, and I think white gets a pretty serious advantage here. If he takes and plays something like rook e8, the problem is eventually I'm going to play like bishop f3 and f5 and maybe rook g1. I think the engine wants to start with rook g1 and go for these moves anyway. And yeah, white just has a ton of pressure on the king side, and it's really, really tough for black. So that was a bit unfortunate because I had kind of figured out the right idea and then convinced myself not to play it. So I ended up going for f3, which is a little bit slow. He goes knight e8, which is a fantastic move. And now he wants to essentially play knight to c7 and take the pawn. Suddenly I realized I'm in trouble, and now I play f4 because I realized, uh-oh, I don't have any time to waste. But without his knight on f6, he can simply play f6 himself and keep the structure completely blocked. So now when f takes c5 happens, he doesn't have to play de and leave the c5 pawn hanging. Instead, he can, of course, play fe, and his structure stays super solid. My bishops stay completely blocked, and white's position is actually just overextended. Black is super solid here and is already better. So I play bishop f3, knight c7, bishop g4. I tried to activate my bishop, but I didn't realize this was actually another critical moment. I simply didn't see my opponent's threat, which was to play bishop to e8 and rounding up the pawn even further. Yeah, somehow missed that this is what he wanted to do, although of course he was centering all of his forces around the b5 pawn. I thought I simply have to play for activity, but yeah, I needed to play queen f1. This was basically the only way to actually defend the pawn, with idea to play bishop e2 next move in case of bishop e8. Obviously not against any move, because then the e4 and d5 pawns would simply fall. But yeah, I played bishop g4, bishop e8, and here I realized I was losing, which is accurate. And yeah, basically I couldn't save the game after this. He took on b5, and everything in my position just ends up totally hanging, and the game was basically over very, very quickly. So yeah, that was a bummer. That definitely could have gone my way had I played the middle game with a little bit more direct attacking instincts. But okay, what to do? In round 6, I played International Master Justin Tan, I believe, of the London Lions, and I sacrificed the pawn in the opening. This is a pretty theoretical line against the Vienna variation. And we have not a theoretical position here, but we've just left theory a few moves ago. And basically white's idea here is, you know, we've given up a pawn in the opening, but in return we get a lot of pressure against black's position. In particular, this e6 pawn typically ends up very, very weak in these positions. So black's last move was c5, trying to maybe counterattack in the center and trade off some pawns. If black can liquidate material and end up a pawn up, this is how black typically tries to play for a win in this kind of position. But usually white is able to generate enough counterplay to kind of compensate for the missing pawn. But here I simply just tried to cash in too quickly, and I didn't follow the advice that I typically give, which is not to play just to try to win your pawn back. When you're down a pawn and playing for the initiative, you should just be thinking about how to keep the pressure up as much as possible. So white had a couple moves here. I ended up playing bishop takes e6, which I think is a mistake. Better was queen g3, which forces black to, let's say, trade on f4. Then after c takes d4, black has a hard time developing here because white is going to be playing d5 very soon and trying to win the pawn back under much more serious circumstances. So I think white is going to be slightly better there. Another move that was certainly possible is like rook a d1, with idea to simply keep all of the pressure in the position, improving the rook, and preparing to play d5 in the near future. Maybe not right away because this would run into e5, but after future queen g3, I'm sure this is going to be possible. Okay, instead I played bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, and d5, and I basically knew I'm not really getting anything here, but I was more or less just trying to equalize the material and get some kind of solid position. But yeah, I think objectively this was fine, it's just that I had much more ambitious opportunities. So he goes rook f6, I go rook e5, just building up on the pin, queen d6, d takes e6, rook takes e6. Now I could win my pawn back right away with rook takes f5, and after queen takes f4, rook f4. I think this endgame is pretty much equal, but I didn't love it because I think if anyone is worse, it's definitely white with isolated pawns on the queen side that are slightly weaker than black's pawns, and so I felt like I didn't really want to defend this. Instead I played rook a1, which I think is totally fine, just keeping some pressure in the position. He goes rook f8, g3, and I did a good job here of simply not panicking that I was a pawn down. I knew I had almost always enough compensation to make up for the missing pawn. After queen takes e5, rook takes e5. For instance, here it seems like I'm a pawn down, but b6, rook e7, and because of the activity of the rook, white is going to be able to win back the pawn very quickly. Black always has to spend the key tempo to cover the back rank and is never in time to defend the pawns. So instead he keeps the queens on the board. I think he was understandably trying to play for a win. I play queen e7, rook e5. I basically just try to stay as active as possible, and here I'm actually winning the pawn back finally. Because I'm hitting this pawn, he is kind of forced to play b6, and then I play queen takes a7. But here, now that the material is equalized, you know, black is the one that gets the initiative with f4. And yeah, this game was quite messy. Objectively, I was fine for most of it. I'm just going to get to the critical moment where I start to mess up. Basically, I just tried to keep my king safe here. I think king safety is the most important factor in heavy piece positions, queen and rook versus queen and rook, for instance. And yeah, I was doing quite okay here. I mean, the material is equal. Any kind of rook endgame is going to be totally fine for me because I have this outside a pawn. But he, of course, keeps the queens on the board, tries to keep his chances alive. I start pushing my pawn, and yeah, then he finds a really strong plan of starting to push his kingside pawns. This was definitely putting me under a lot of pressure because now the pawns are rolling and he can try to use them in the attack. So I started feeling the pressure. I played rook g2, h4. Strong move. If I take the pawn with check, he actually has rook h6, and my queen has no way of defending against the threat of queen b1 mate, so this is just bad for white. Instead, I just try to keep active with queen a7, queen d4, and he goes g5. So he's really going for it. I mean, his idea turns out to be to bring the king forward and to push g4 and get his pawns rolling even further. I played rook g4, rook e7, and here I simply missed a tactical shot. I could have played the move rook takes h4 check. The main point is that if he recaptures, which he probably should, then after queen takes h4, I'm picking up the rook on e7, and even though white is 2 pawns up, black's queen is active enough to give a perpetual check. So this ends up just being a draw with best play. Although black is the one who has to be precise here. For instance, queen d1 check would allow white to block with queen e1, and here black is actually running out of checks and not securing a draw, and white is probably winning. Instead, black has to play queen h3 check so that king e2 can be met with queen d3, and here black is securing a pretty trivial draw. So yeah, I missed rook takes h4. Black doesn't have to take the rook, he can play king g6, but after rook h8, I think this is riskier for black than it is for white because the king really looks very weak on g6, and white has a lot of checks in the position. So this looks quite dangerous. Objectively, he would probably have to just take the rook and go for this drawn line. But yeah, I missed that one. I mean, I certainly had enough time to find it in the position. I think I had maybe a minute here, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less actually, I'm not sure. But yeah, the tactic is definitely not that hard that I'm not able to see it. I think it was more of just, at this point, I'm trying to just keep the game solid, trying not to blunder, and I certainly just wasn't looking for these opportunities. So instead I played king g2, just keeping things solid, and now he goes for this plan with king g6 and threatening king h5. Which looks very dangerous because my rook is getting caught, and if I play f3, I always have to reckon with rook e2 check, which looks really dangerous. So I played queen d6 check, rook e6, and then I went back to d4. But this was essentially a losing blunder. The only move was queen d1, which I just didn't see, defending the rook from this angle and also stopping king h5, as there's going to be a discovery check, and of course I can evacuate my rook whenever I need to. After queen d4, king h5, it's now just over. The rook is trapped and I'm losing. I try queen h8 check, but he simply takes the rook with the king, and I'm not able to get any kind of perpetual here, as his king is able to just slowly wiggle out. I tried to give as many checks as I could, but eventually the checks ended up running out and I had to give up the game. So quite a tough one. I definitely don't feel like I deserve to lose this one, but well, I mean, of course my opponent put a lot of pressure on me, and I have to give him credit for that, because that's kind of what induced me to end up making enough mistakes to lose the game. Okay, so the final round was quite tough for me. I was playing against Grandmaster Torbjorn Ringdal Hansen from Norway, and I actually got a very reasonable position from the opening. I played the knight c6 line again, and we ended up reaching this position with opposite sides castling. Similar to my game against Beerdsen, where I feel like black had a very, very nice version of things. And yeah, in this position, I ended up spotting an opportunity to play knight takes e4, followed by an eventual d5, forking some of white's pieces. And for some reason, I couldn't resist the temptation to go for this one, although objectively it was quite bad. A much better move would have been to play something like queen to b6, just developing the queen very actively, targeting the b2 pawn. From here, black can follow up with moves like rook b8, maybe rook e8 to defend the e7 pawn, and eventually this knight can maybe start maneuvering and opening up the bishop on g7. And here, yeah, I feel like black basically has a very, very creative and I think active position. If white goes for something like, let's say b3, rook e8, and e5, then simply knight d7, and this diagonal is going to be very, very promising for black. Yeah, instead I ended up going for knight takes e4, and I think I was basically fatigued. This was the final round 7. Of course, the day had not gone super well for me so far. I was only on 1.5 out of 6. And yeah, I think I was more just hoping that this was working rather than really calculating concretely and making sure that this was a good decision. Because I recognized that my position here was quite nice, so I felt like I should have something, but this was, I think this was just way too optimistic. So the problem is after knight takes e4, knight takes e4, rook takes e4, d5, the line I did see was that after bishop takes e7, which looks very bad, I think black has queen b6, threatening the mate on b2, and of course keeping the attack on white's pieces. And I think objectively black is doing somewhat alright here, although I'm not exactly sure about that. But much stronger is what my opponent did in the game, which was rook takes e7. Taking the pawn this way, I'm forced to play d takes e4 to win back my piece, although actually f6 was apparently a move. And maybe I should have found this one. I mean, during the game, I didn't even consider I had any other options other than d takes c4. After the game, Stockfish, of course, pointed out this resource of f6, which keeps white's rook under attack, keeps the bishop under attack, and then, of course, attacks this bishop. And objectively, white can still keep an advantage here with queen e3, just defending the rook on e7. But still, it was a better try than what I did in the game, which after d takes c4, we end up getting into this endgame. Where materials equal, but I think my pawns on the queen side are a lot weaker than white's weak pawns on the king side. And the main reason for that is white's rook is simply already active and has easy access to these pawns, whereas my rook just has no way of getting over to the king side and attacking these pawns. So basically my pawns are weaker, his pieces I think are a little bit more active, and he ends up playing I think a nice endgame to convert in, basically just not giving me any chances to equalize. He played this move f5. I think this wasn't super necessary. He could have taken on a7, but he was probably didn't like the move f6. And then after bishop h4, his bishop is kind of sidelined. So even though he's a pawn up and probably totally winning, it feels a little bit trickier to play this position for white. So instead he goes for f5, kind of a positional sacrifice, where if I take, then he'll take, and all of my pawns are super weak. I started with h6, and then grabbed the pawn. Rook takes a7. I tried to play c3 just to trade off one of my weaknesses and try to maybe make things difficult for him. But he just takes, bishop takes c3, and this a-pawn ends up being the deciding factor in the game. It's just too strong, and my pieces are not able to stop it. So he starts running the pawn, and yeah, his technique in this game I think was really really instructive, because it looks very simple, but I think it's not always this easy, especially in a blitz game, to just find like very careful, accurate moves and not give your opponent any chances, which is basically what happened. So I just basically tried to run my pawns up as much as I could, but I wasn't able to create any counterplay, and he was able to slowly bring in his king, play c3 to shut out my bishop, and now it's basically over. And I'm simply not able to stop his pawn in time. Okay, the game ended up ending pretty soon after king c4, rook e2, a6, bishop takes f2, and simply it's not fast enough. White is just promoting first. Bishop takes d4, he promoted, and it was time to call it quits, as he's getting ready to play queen f3 check next move, and the game is over. So yeah, a tough finish for me. After my one win, I ended up just getting knocked with 3 losses in a row, ending on 1.5 out of 7. So I feel like I did have my chances in these games, especially in round 1, and some of my losses I think could have at least been either drawn, or maybe I could have fought for the advantage at some points. But okay, I understand this is online chess. There's a lot of variance. It's very tough to play well and to play fast. You typically have to kind of choose one or the other. Overall, my strategy was to try not fall behind on the clock, because we've all seen how time trouble can make even the best players look really, really dumb. And I think I did a good job of managing my time, but as a result, my play definitely suffered, missing a lot of things, not really taking the time to calculate when it really mattered, and yeah, making a lot of mistakes in the process. Overall, the team was doing quite well, thanks to the play of my teammates, who were all doing reasonably well. We were in 3rd place for most of the day, but I think we had kind of an unlucky last round, and we ended up getting 5th place and not really gaining a lot in the standings. Yeah, I definitely feel a little bit at fault. I feel like I didn't pull my weight or earn my fair share, but what can you do? Chess is really tough, and the results don't always go your way. That said, it was instructive to go through the games and see a lot of the things that I missed and overlooked and miscalculated and rejected, or didn't analyze long enough, and hopefully I can do better in the future. Thanks a lot for tuning in to this video. Hopefully it was instructive for you guys as well. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please make sure to do so. It'll mean a lot to me. Thanks, and take care.